Anastasia, thanks so much for coming on today and being willing to share a little bit more about your story. I know for you that starts pretty young and you have some pretty formative experiences where your family are from in Russia and even with the Orthodox Church. So I'd love it if you could take us through that and speak a little bit to your experiences there.
Yeah, awesome, Stephen. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here and continue to share my testimony because I actually came, as you'll hear a little bit of as we go on, to Christianity through people's testimonies. I came out of the New Age into fully following Jesus through other people's testimonies. So I'm always so happy to share mine. All right. So, childhood, I grew up in Russia, as you said, in Moscow. And the predominant faith over there, at least from my cultural experience, is Orthodox Christianity. So I kind of grew up in that cultural faith, but it wasn't very much practiced in my household. I definitely wasn't really taught anything. We did go to the Orthodox Church here and there, but definitely not regularly, like even some select few holidays, right? So very much cultural Christianity. And even my parents don't really have a foundation in the Bible. Like I don't think they've ever read the Bible from my conversations with them. They never studied it or read it or opened it. And it's just not something that's really taught in Orthodox churches. So at least from my experience, there's not really a Bible study element in the service. It's very much like ceremonial in its service. So they didn't really have any teachings to kind of rock or found their faith in, right? Like as a foundation for their
Yep.
faith. So they were baptized in secret during the Soviet Union, and they kind of
Wow.
were they had to kind of keep their faith secret growing up. So even that I think might be a bit of a barrier for like why they couldn't go deeper in understanding their faith. By the time I was born, of course, the Soviet Union was no longer a thing. But that's still kind of the household I grew up in where my parents didn't have that foundation and we didn't really practice. When we moved over to the States, I was 7, it was 2003. And we didn't really, nothing really changed in terms of our faith, but I would say we were maybe attending church even less because it was hard for my parents to find a church that really they felt comfortable with. So Russian Orthodox churches, when we first moved to Ohio in the US, were even less common. And then when we moved to the East Coast, it was maybe there was like one church within an hour's drive or something like that. So that's kind of the household I grew up in. Where do you want me to take it from there? I have so much I can cover.
Yeah, that's incredible. There's a lot of, I mean, it's incredible that they grew up in Russia with the Soviet Union. I mean, I've got a million questions there already. I
Yeah.
don't know. Did they share any experiences with you about what it was like growing up there and like trying to pursue religion, or was that not something talked about too much because they weren't, like you say, they were more culturally Christian?
Yeah. It's something we've been talking about, I think, a little bit more now that I'm practicing Christianity. Now that I'm going to church regularly, I'm reading my Bible. My parents are really confused as to why that even happened, especially because it's not something they raised me with. So it started those conversations of, well, what did you experience growing up? To my parents, right? What is your background? Have you ever read the Bible? And that's how I started finding out that, in fact, they haven't and they don't really have that background. So, all I really know at this point, because my parents are a bit of closed books, a bit reluctant to talk about anything challenging or personal or emotional. And I think with their faith, again, I'm not really sure there's much to talk about. So my dad shared that they were baptized in secret, or at least he was. I'm sure they all were at the time. And he didn't share anything in terms of like Bibles or church attendance or anything like that. So all I really know is they definitely continued like baptizing people during the Soviet Union and continued sharing the gospel, I'm sure, but it was obviously had to be done in secret. So
Yeah, I mean that's incredible. It's like it shows us how important it is to preserve our own religious freedom, I think, in the West, and that these things are. I mean, that's in your parents' lifetime. You know, I think for the younger generation, sometimes we forget. We think all of this 20th century history is so far removed from us that it couldn't possibly happen today. But anyway,
yeah,
I digress. That's sort of a personal interest of mine, so I had to
no, it's
selfishly
fine.
ask about that. But so you come to America, you're still kind of in a sort of place of cultural Christianity, I suppose. And I know you start to experience some mental health struggles, and then eventually you find yourself participating more and more in the New Age movement. So perhaps you could speak a little
Mhm.
bit to that.
Yeah. So I really started experiencing depression when I was a teenager. Really, once I hit puberty, there's definitely some element there at play. But once I hit puberty, I really started experiencing depression pretty heavy. Right away came with thoughts of like wanting to end my life and things like that. Pretty severe depression pretty early on. So when that hit is really when I started to take an interest in mental health and really for my own benefit, right? Had to try to figure out what to do. And coming from a Russian culture, it's not something that we really talked about. If anything, if I behaved badly or I like was too emotional, my mom was like, "We're gonna send you to a convent," as like an empty threat joke sort of thing. That's kind of, or we're gonna send you to like a mental asylum and things of that nature. So it wasn't something, and they didn't mean that. They wouldn't have actually done that,
Yeah.
but it was the kind of response that I would get from my parents regarding emotional well-being. So I didn't really have that support there or that education there in my family. So I sought it out for myself. That's kind of how the journey started of taking interest in trauma and mental health and self-help and the psychology sort of world. And that's kind of what I dove into from that point on. I constantly read all the books and watched all the documentaries and all that stuff. And one way or another, it kind of opened the door to new age ideas because, as you probably know, once you get into kind of the self help world, that those ideas are rooted there or like begin there for a lot of people. Even in high school, we had I think it was called mindfulness. We had a class my senior year. You got to choose your physical education class. So I chose, I think it was called mindfulness, and they did yoga and like vision boards and all kinds of kind of new age practices. And that opened the door to those for me. So that's kind of how I ended up tiptoeing into the new age. And I started meditating and practicing yoga and things like that. And then it just kind of progressed from there as the new age and the self help worlds kind of married together in my experience. So it all really was rooted in my wanting to help myself, right? So many of us are struggling with so many things and we just want to feel better. We just want to feel happy, or we just want to feel normal or at ease. And so many of us, I think, in our modern world are motivated by our feelings. They're motivated by feeling good and wanting to feel happy. So that's kind of the road I was on.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. A lot of people that I've spoken to enter into the New Age movement because they see it as sort of a way to heal trauma and to manage symptoms of, a bad mental health state. So I can totally understand how you found yourself in that position. And from your testimony video online, which I'll obviously link below if people are interested in watching your full testimony, you speak a lot about shadow work and how you start to enter shadow work. And I know that shadow work, I think, comes from the idea of Carl Jung and the shadow. And Jung is somebody that I've found fascinating, if not a little bit dangerous at times. And I've been introduced to him through the work of Jordan Peterson, who's really, really heavily influenced by Jung. And obviously, Peterson's one of the most influential intellectuals of, I suppose, the 21st century, right? These days, anyway, he's all over the place. And so Jung is not dead. Jung is still having an influence today in the New Age movement and all over the world. And so I really wanted to get your opinions on shadow work, how you got into shadow work. Perhaps you could help us to understand what shadow work is as we get into that, because I think it's important for Christians to understand that.
Yeah. Yeah. It'd be my pleasure. Shadow work is what I taught as a coach. So I'm a coach still, now a faith-based coach, but I've been a coach mainly with Jungian and a little bit of new age foundations as like what I taught and how I helped people. So I'd be happy to talk about shadow work.
Awesome.
It's literally the primary thing I taught for about 3.5 years. Um, and I landed in shadow work, as you said, kind of wanting to help myself, wanting to heal. As I talked about in my full testimony on my channel, I struggled with that depression from puberty onward. Like it just never really eased up and it came in waves or cycles. And every cycle seemed to get more severe or more intense. So fast forward from like age 13 to age 22, 23, I forgot how old exactly I was, in early 2019. I was at my worst in terms of the depression. I literally at this point couldn't really get myself to do anything. It was this kind of just blanket apathy about life. And I was just kind of desperate at that point. I tried therapy, I tried all the things that are kind of the more conventional approaches to dealing with depression, except for medication. I had never tried that, so I can't speak to that. But everything other than medication, I had tried. And in 2019, I came across a shadow work course. At that point, shadow work was a lot less commonly talked about online. I really saw it explode in 2020 during the pandemic. In early 2019, it was a little bit more in kind of pockets of the new age community online, and pockets of the coaching kind of self-help community. So this creator I admired and was following created a shadow work course, and it was pretty cheap. It was like $90. So I just took a try on it. And that was my first experience. It was kind of a shamanic approach to shadow work. So there are many different ways to practice shadow work. It's really a theoretical concept, as it sounds like you're familiar with. It's more of an idea, shadow work per se, or like the shadow. Carl Jung's idea of the shadow is more of like an intellectual theory, right? It's not really a practice in itself. So then from there are many ways to try to work with the shadow and try to utilize the shadow to heal yourself. And the approach that I was taught and the approach that I then went on to teach others is really to enter this kind of like meditative, almost hypnotic state, a little bit more conscious than in hypnosis, but really deep meditative state. And then from there, like your shadow arises and you have these visual experiences and that sort of thing, all like without drugs or anything. And the idea is to integrate your shadow. What that means is to essentially like fully accept and embrace all the bad parts of you, which is not something I would advocate for now as a Christian. And we can talk about that more in depth if you'd like. And I did a full 180 on that once I came to Christ. But that was what I taught for a really long time. And that first experience I had, not only did I hear God, actually, at this point, I can't say exactly what he said. I didn't write it down, unfortunately, but I just remember the experience of hearing God's audible voice for the first and only time ever in my life. So I think it opened the door to something for me spiritually. Before that, I was very much like agnostic, bordering on atheism at that point in my life. But also, the depression eased. It just lifted. And I equated that to shadow work. And in retrospect, I would equate it to God. In retrospect, I would call it a miracle that God worked in me. But because of that practice, I was also very practice oriented, I think, as so many of us right now are in this kind of humanist society where we do things like we heal ourselves. We got to do things in order for something to happen, in order to see results. Mm-hmm. Whereas obviously we who follow Christ can hand it over to him and really can be totally dependent on him in a very beautiful way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I didn't invite you on to speak about Jung so much, but seeing that this is something that was a huge part of your life with shadow work and everything like that, did you delve into other sort of Jungian concepts? Like I know, for example, Jung came up with this notion. I don't know if Jung came up with it or if it was like originally seen with Nietzsche, but this concept of the psyche. And I'm sort of wondering what parts of Jungian psychotherapy you see as still being kind of beneficial. Like you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? Obviously, Jung and Freud have had a huge influence on secular psychology, which some people, can still really benefit from. I think seeing a therapist, sort of learning about these concepts. But how do you take the beneficial parts of Jung and then disregard those parts that lead people into the occult? I don't know if you could speak to that. That's kind of a huge topic to just throw over at you, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it is a big topic, so I don't think we can cover all of it. And I will say I didn't dive too deeply into Jung. I kind of have surface level understanding of his shadow work theories and kind of his construct of the human psyche, as well as inner child work is very much rooted in Jung. So those are kind of the central practices that I taught as the foundation for really the rest of my work. But sorry, can you hear my cat or is it fine?
I can't hear your cat. You're doing well. But yeah, maybe you could speak a little bit to inner child theory then, if that was something that you taught on. Perhaps that's an area that you are still passionate about today in
Yeah.
explaining.
Yeah, it is. I would say that's a great example of something that I think can coexist with Christianity and doesn't really compete with it in any way or contradict the Bible in any way. Whereas shadow work, I mean, directly contradicts repentance. That's really
True.
probably my main issue with it, is that at least the way I practiced it, and I actually, at the time that I was teaching it, had a big issue with the way it was being taught in other places where if you're practicing shadow work on the level of just kind of mental reflection and journaling, I taught that that's not really sufficient because you're not really working at the subconscious level. You're still working with the conscious mind, and therefore you're kind of filtering
Mm-hmm.
what's coming through. So I taught that a lot. And as a result, I was like, well, not the only way, but the way that I found to be easiest and most effective was to work with the subconscious directly by getting into like a meditative state. And that's already opening doors and like kind of dangerous. So I definitely wouldn't stand by anything I taught then in that regard. There may be ways of kind of finding common ground between shadow work and Christianity. Right now, I don't have that answer for you because of the world I came from and really the way that I practiced and taught and viewed shadow work myself. But inner child work is obviously a big part of modern contemporary psychology. Like I think almost every therapist um, uses it in some way. And it's a very simple concept that doesn't really take you into the occult because Carl Jung was very much into the occult,
Oh yeah.
as a lot of us probably know. So it's a lot of his theories are kind of walking that line between occult practices and just pure psychology. While inner child work, I feel like is a little bit safer in that regard. And that's something that my next program is actually going to be like a faith-based version of inner child work.
Oh, that's really cool. So people should stay tuned for that. Yeah, I should mention that all of Anastasia's links are going to be in the description box below, so you can find her Instagram there, which is the best place to connect with her. Yeah, it was interesting hearing you speak and even using that kind of language of the conscious and the unconscious, which is rooted in Jung. But I think there's undeniably a part of ourselves that is not, fully accessible to like your conscious mind. So I mean, it seems to be a reality that Jung discovered, that we should find a way to engage with in a way that's helpful, productive. And I also like the way that you phrased it, as long as it's not competing with Christianity, it's not setting itself up against the word of God. I think that's a really good guiding principle to enter these discussions with. So thanks very much for that. So you're entering in this period of your life where you're trying to heal your depression. You're starting to find shadow work. You're starting to practice the occult. I know you have some experiences in college with different sort of substances and things like that. Perhaps you could speak a little bit to that and just unfold your story a little more for us.
Sure, my pleasure. College, I suppose I engaged with a few different substances, but it wasn't really something that I have some friends who had really intense experiences with seeing all kinds of crazy stuff on psychedelics and things of that nature. I thankfully did not. It was more of an emotional experience. And that's something that really is consistent throughout my life. I'm very much, actually, I feel like since I found God, it's interesting. God has kind of stabilized my emotions, which has been such a great gift. But up until I really started following Jesus, I had a lot of emotional volatility throughout my life and very strong emotions. So consistent with that, when I experimented with, say, psychedelics, it was really just mushrooms. And even a couple things like cocaine a couple times and things like that throughout my college years, my main effect was emotional. And both times on psychedelics, it just produced this intense feeling of dread. That's really the main experience I had, which in retrospect kind of makes sense if you're opening doors to you don't know what. But it was this intense experience of dread and anxiety. And the only visual experiences I had were pretty mild, of like things kind of warping in and out. But something that stuck with me forever, I walked into the bathroom at some point on one of my like two, that's it, two psychedelic experiences on mushrooms. And I looked at myself in the mirror and saw my reflection. And I saw, and I don't know if this is like me seeing myself in the spirit or what this was, if this has like a spiritual correlation or if this was just your brain. Obviously, I don't have the answers on that, but I saw just the most like run down looking human. I don't know how to explain it. The way I described it to the people around me at the time was I looked like I forgot his name, but he's the dad in the TV show Shameless. And he's this like alcoholic, druggy figure in that show. So I looked like somebody like run down by drugs, just like my skin was just like pale and sickly. And I looked so much older than I was. Like I looked like I was like 90 years old and not a graceful 90. Like that's what I saw in the mirror was this body that was just almost dead. Um, so that's something that stuck with me. But those were kind of my experiences with those types of things, more emotional. A lot of anxiety would come up during those times.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And then, so again, obviously having these emotional experiences, you're struggling with your mental health. Are you still struggling with your mental health? I know you said that clears up around 25 for you, was it? Or
Yeah, 23, I think. So 2019. No, I'm not. Obviously, I have emotions. But even that, like I said, once I actually fully followed Christ, that's stabilized. And I feel like I have a pretty normal emotional life for the first time ever, where those emotional kind of mood swings and volatile emotions have stabilized. But aside from that, depression really hasn't reared its head since 2019. So that's 4.5-ish years now.
that's really incredible. Yeah. And we definitely need to get into that and how you came across. I think one more topic, I guess, that was kind of influential in your own story or important in your own stories when you start to get into channeling.
Mhm.
And so what kind of leads you into channeling and what is channeling for people who might not know what that is?
Yeah. When really around the time that I opened that door to shadow work and I practiced that for the first time, I opened the door to kind of everything occult and new age and spiritual. So I think within a month of that, I started getting into um, chakras and crystals and really weird things that I don't know if you have or have not heard of. It depends on how much experience you've had in the new age with things like star seeds and things of that nature. And along with that kind of came exposure through YouTube primarily to people who channeled. And I thought it was the coolest thing and I wanted to do it. So, one thing you might know about me or you might have discovered through some of my testimony is when I become interested in something, I become very deeply invested and very kind of intense in my pursuit of it. So that's what happened with all things new age is once I opened the door to shadow work, kind of everything flooded in because I was intensely pursuing it. So with channeling, that's kind of a more, I would say, kind of advanced new age idea and practice in the sense that if you're just kind of into crystals and putting them around your house, you're probably not going to start being interested in channeling. But for me, because I go deep so fast, that's what I did. So the first time I encountered it on YouTube, I just kind of binged a bunch of channelers and then I decided to try it for myself. I really wanted it to happen to me. What it is essentially is you're opening your body to possession. That's like the short of it. Um, and the idea is that you are receiving advanced information from spiritual beings, whether it be extraterrestrials or interdimensional, like aliens, or your spirit guides, or like angels, or what have you. Some people think they channel Jesus, like all kinds of stuff. Yeah. So at the time, there was a specific kind of alien entity that I was interested in channeling because I had watched this pretty famous channel and kind of binged his stuff. And so I wanted to try contacting that specific being. And I sat down on my floor. This was my first time trying to channel, maybe my second time. And I just kind of sat there in like a meditative pose, closed my eyes, and invited it in. And although I didn't really give it full control of my body, and I do think this was like God protecting me because I wanted to, there was no
Mm.
part of me that was like trying to hold back. But it didn't really, it couldn't manipulate kind of my voice. It couldn't speak through me. It couldn't really manipulate my hands or anything like that, but it could manipulate my head. So what I was experiencing at the time was just receiving messages in my mind, and the manipulation of my head in either a nod or a shake of the head. So I would ask it questions and it would either have my head nod or shake my head no. And at some point, one of my cats walked into the room and she freaked out. Like all her hair stood up on her back. She bolted out of the room. And she was kind of traumatized and terrified for maybe an hour or two after that. Like this shook her deeply and had an effect on her for a little while. Which I found amusing at the time and silly. And I'm like, oh, there must be something here. That's great. And she just like, she's never seen something like this before. It must be an alien. They're just like, what is that? I really didn't think anything of it in terms of maybe I shouldn't be doing this. Maybe this is indication that there's something dangerous or frightening here. It was just confirmation basically for me that I was actually doing something. I was actually communicating with something and I wasn't just like talking to myself in my head.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's like I'm thinking a little bit about your background too here, because I remember in your testimony video you say that you'd be having a conversation with your mom, I think, at one point about orthodoxy, and you were denying the fact that a flame could be lit, right? Like that supernatural miracle element of it. At what stage did your worldview start to allow for things like whether it's aliens or spiritual entities to exist? At what point was there like that shift for you?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say it probably happened gradually. Unlike most of the shifts in my life, like the depression lifting or deciding to follow Christ, that was like a one moment conviction. This probably happened gradually. I suppose before even the shadow work, I said like I started inching my way into new age through yoga and stuff like that. And somewhere in between those two points in time, I also entered veganism. So I was vegan for a couple of years. And through that world, there was a lot of overlap in the creators on YouTube who were vegan and stuff and who taught the law of attraction. So that was my entry point into, I suppose, some kind of spirituality. And that opened me up to the idea of things happening by kind of miraculous means, or there being a universe, there being a sort of force at play that was that had some agency out in the world that I could rely on, that I could, at the time, it was like use for my own gain, right? Use to have my own will be done. But it was this idea that there's something beyond me that probably opened the door to that. But it was still very challenging for me to even grasp that mentally. I wanted to, but only because I wanted my will to be done, right? I wanted it to use as a sort of like witchcraft. I wanted to use law of attraction for my benefit so I could get what I want, I could get a job I want, or whatever it is, or like a boyfriend I want. So that's kind of how I entered that space. Was I wanted to have what I want in my life. And there was this like mental block of, I want to practice this law of attraction, but I couldn't emotionally fully let go and believe and have faith. And it wasn't until that experience with shadow work that I found faith. Like I experienced a miracle, I suppose. I experienced a depression lifting. Like I tangibly had it changed my body and my mind. And so that, I think, flipped a switch for me in terms of faith. Before that experience with the depression being lifted, I told you I was emotionally volatile for pretty much my whole life up until I found Christ. And a piece of that experience showed up as this intense fear for my loved ones. And anytime I cared for anyone, I couldn't stand the thought of them being hurt. Like I couldn't emotionally handle it. So my boyfriend at the time, he's now my husband, he played rugby in college. And you being from Australia, you know what the sport is like. It's pretty intense. And I was like crying every day when he had practice and at games, and nothing happened to him. Like he didn't have any severe injuries or anything like that. Worst thing he'd have was like a bruise or something like that. So I had no logical reason. And that's actually one of the reasons I started therapy, was to deal with that, to see if somebody could help me through that. And she couldn't. Anyway, she couldn't. So when we first moved in together, and this was right before I came to Christ, so we lived together before we got married. And when we first moved in together, he would be coming home to me after his practices and his games. And I was just like almost having panic attacks, expecting him to come home, like out of fear that something happened and like he was severely injured. And that was a big wrench in our relationship because I couldn't emotionally handle it. I was like distraught several days a week, like on the ground bawling over nothing. And he obviously like loved the sport and loved his team and all this type of stuff. He had a big community there. And so it put us at these crossroads of, okay, do we stay together? Like, does he stop playing? That sort of thing. It was like a couple months later that I did the shadow work, and my depression lifted. And that also really flipped the switch on faith. And I was suddenly okay with whatever happened. I was suddenly like, whatever happens, there's a reason. And if you're not meant to get hurt, you won't. And I really had this kind of predestination sort of view of what were to happen to him playing rugby. So that allowed me to kind of release it to the universe at the time, and no longer worry. That was the first time I could release my worry to something.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And that kind of leads us into what is the best part of your testimony, as far as I'm concerned, as a Christian, is when you start to experience Christ and Christianity, and you make this. I don't know if you'd call it a return, because I don't know if you ever identified as a Christian before, or if you were just culturally Christian, but you start to come to Christ, and perhaps you can talk a little bit to that.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know if I would call it a return either, because actually think that one of the reasons that I had such a, I don't know if I'd say smooth, but I would say like I had no barrier to Christianity other than kind of the conditioning in society at the time. I thought Christians were judgy, and I thought all these things that aren't true. Now that I'm actually going to church and I'm part of the Christian community, I'm like, that's not true at all. But I had all these kind of socialized ideas of what Christianity might be. But thankfully, I didn't have any negative experiences of my own with the church. I didn't have church hurt, and I didn't really have any ties to what the church should be. I didn't really have any stake in it. So it was easy enough for me to just try it out and be really open to it. The hardest thing for me to break through was those kind of like those stereotypes I held in my head. But because I didn't really have any negative experiences with like my parents misrepresenting Christianity or my church growing up, I found that to be a huge blessing, because I see a lot of people in the new age are sticking to it because they have really bad church hurt. A lot of the people in the new age that I'm personally familiar with actually did grow up with some semblance of Christianity. Some actually were really heavily involved in their church, and their parents were like leaders in the church, and their parents really poorly misrepresented Christ. And that creates an extra barrier for them to coming back, because they're putting onto God what is just human sin, right? So yeah, I would say I found Christ very much by accident, as I feel like is always the case. I wasn't looking for Christ. I really felt like I actually had a solid relationship with what I thought God was at the time. And that was very much like a personal relationship with the universe, is what I called it. But even at that point, I was calling the universe God. But without the Christian worldview, I really had no idea who the Christian God was. I really had no idea what the Bible had to say about God. It was really my own ideas with my own personal experiences. And that was a God of grace and love. Like the truth element was missing, the righteous judge element was missing, but the grace and love were there. So I felt like that was all I needed. And I felt like I had a strong relationship with God. What ended up leading me to the church was this desire for community, which is a big gap in our society today, right? So many of us feel isolated or are craving some kind of deep community in our lives. And my husband and I were talking about starting a family and starting to have children. And we had recently moved away from his extended family. So I really started thinking about how do we create what he had, which he had a really big, beautiful, tight-knit Irish family back east in the States. And I didn't have that. So we both wanted to recreate what he had and what I didn't have, which is a tight-knit community that's there for each other through thick and thin. And I was talking to this woman. I was volunteering at the library at the time, and God used this woman to direct me to church. I was talking to this woman about this, and she had left her family in California behind and was saying, like, how if you can, I would suggest you be close to your family, and it's really helpful and all this stuff. But we also have a strong community through our church. And because this woman kind of looked more like me, she kind of looked like a hippie in some way, I actually took her advice. And this is something I've talked about a lot with one of my friends who was saved out of the strip club. And she still is kind of figuring out how to dress more modestly and how to not look like a party girl, because that's her past. And something that Christians kind of comment on a lot. She's also on social media and has a podcast and things like that. So she gets a lot of comments regarding that sort of thing. And something that stuck out to her from my testimony and has stuck with me since she mentioned it is God uses those things in our lives. God uses those things to save those who might not otherwise listen. Because, for example, with me, because I could see her New Age past on her page, and I could scroll back on her Instagram and see those old posts and see that she actually did believe the things I believed, and she actually did practice the things I practiced. So she gets in. She's not just judging me from the outside looking in. That gave her testimony more credibility. So to me, at least. So this other woman who, I don't know her past, I don't know her story, I don't know her testimony, but she looked like she was an artist. She had like short hair and she was wearing like colors and all this stuff. She looked to me like somebody who would get it. She like did acupuncture, somebody who I could relate to. And so that kind of opened the door. And there was this other woman who almost became a coaching client of mine, but didn't, simply because the stuff I was talking about, the shadow work, seemed to kind of ring alarm bells for her as a Christian woman. But we got coffee one time and she invited me to her church. And I remembered her at this point. This was like a few months later. I remembered her and sent her a text, and we went to her church. That was the first time we attended church. And that just opened the door to like church shopping, and we started looking for the right community. But that was the reason behind it. We were looking for community. What I didn't know what happened was that God would use that cracked door to really pull me into following him fully.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And so what was your experience of church like for the first time? Because I'm assuming it was probably like more of an evangelical church, or what kind of church context was it when you first attended?
It was a non-denominational church. It was a big like, auditorium, non-denominational church. And it was huge, and they had a coffee shop inside, and my husband hated that. Coming from a Catholic background, he was like, this is horrible. How could they? Anyway, so it was that kind of very much like kind of modern church. And I came in with like prickles and bristles, emotionally like ready to deny anything that they presented. And just kind of looking around at the other people and trying to find, I don't even know what I was thinking. Like in retrospect, I don't know how I plan to find community without, while denying everything that the church believes. But anyway, so I came in there, I guess like ready to defend, or to stick with this defensive attitude. And a lot of things kind of bashed up against my current idea, or my then idea of God and who he was, such as in the worship songs, for example. I distinctly remember the idea that we're all broken. And I was like, see, this is why the church is bad. We're not all broken. They're teaching us like we are inadequate and all this stuff. Well, the culture is trying to teach us that we're enough as we are and we don't need to change. And that was kind of the idea that I was a part of. So things like that I bristled up against, and I basically tried to find things to criticize throughout the service. But I left that service with this immense sense of love, almost to the point of tears, and looking around in our drive home and seeing God in everything, which was kind of normal for me at the time. Honestly, it's kind of how I viewed the world, but something changed, something intensified in me after that service. And that kept me coming back to different churches. I think I went back to that church one time at some point, just to give it another go before we settled in a different home church. But in general, it just kept me open to that idea of church. And then what kept me going after that is two things. One, my idea of God as love and grace like was validated at all these churches. They were saying things I agreed with, and then they would also add to God's character. And I found that so interesting. I loved learning more about who God is, and I found that fascinating, and I wanted to know more, and I wanted to know more. So it became this experience of enriching my faith. It became this experience of enhancing my understanding of who God is. And ultimately, I settled at a church that I think some people might call it Grace Church. And then there's a whole story about where we are now and how we're not really, we started looking for something deeper, something more biblical. But at the time, that kind of church where they didn't talk about sin like ever. They didn't talk about repentance. They didn't talk about sexuality. They didn't talk about hard topics that would be polarizing, right? And in fact, when they did, like there was one sermon, and it wasn't even that polarizing. It was just about the idea that there is objective truth, and truth is not subjective, right? I just like had a whole field day with that. And on the ride home with my husband, I was like, no, this is why he's wrong. And this is what's actually right. And my gosh, bless my husband. He is so patient. He is so gentle. He would never be like, actually, you're wrong. He just let me do my thing. And I'm in my church group at the time, because at that point, I was part of small groups and things like that. And I remember at some point, because I was still part of the New Age, I would say, yeah, sometimes in worship songs, when they refer to God as he, sometimes I'll just say she to switch it up, because I believe that God isn't one gender, like those kinds of ideas. And my church group completely still accepted me, and like one of them was like, okay, like you're playing around with heresy. But yeah, and I like bristled at that comment too. And but they were so patient with me. It's so gentle. I'm still part of the same small group, and they're really like my family now. And it's amazing how deeply the church proved me wrong in terms of the stereotypes of them being judgmental or anything like that. Because they were so patient and so gentle, because that's the way God is, right? That's the way God teaches us to be patient and gentle and loving. And he waited for me. God waited for me to kind of inch my way back towards him. He never forced me. And that's the way that his true people, his true representatives are.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And I mean, coming from your background, it's like one of the things you can learn from the psychoanalyst, like we were talking about before, is the importance of somebody's childhood informing their beliefs, even kind of like lifelong. And I know for you, in your childhood, you came from you could call it a scientific background, right? Like your dad was a surgeon. I think you said your mom was in finance somehow, like an accountant. And so that's pretty sort of like this, there's a dominant sort of secular worldview, especially coming from sort of Russian, Russia in the 20th century. Obviously, the prevailing worldview was secularism for a while, at least on a surface level. Was it difficult for you to accept things like Christ's resurrection, the fact that this is what reconciles us to God? Like, how did you start to think through that as you became a Christian?
That's a really good question. And I actually also studied neuroscience and really found myself in the same scientific background that I was raised in, which makes sense. And it's kind of what I gravitated towards. I always wanted to understand everything, like the nitty gritty, down to the cellular level. So that was my background as well. And I think if I had encountered Christ at that point in my life, when I was studying neuroscience, when I was working in research, when I was in college, even, I don't think I would have accepted it. That was really around the time that I was even rejecting things like the fire being lit by miraculous means that my mom talked about. So I think at that point I would definitely rejected it. But at the point where God pulled me in to him, I accepted things far more ridiculous than Christ's resurrection. I think things like the channeling, right? That just progressed. So I accepted a lot of crazy ideas about aliens and all kinds of stuff of that nature, and really was deeply involved in anything supernatural and deeply interested in anything supernatural, even anything witchy, all that kind of stuff. So I really felt like I was communicating with spirits and the deceased and things like that. And I did some events as a medium, like I was doing things like that at that point in my life. So I was completely open to the supernatural at that point. I love how now, and I didn't think about that ever. So thank you for asking that question, because in retrospect, I see now that like God was even more just like, maybe thoughtful is the wrong word, and intentional in how he led me to him. Because if he pushed or pulled at any point earlier, I don't think I would have answered the call.
That makes complete sense. So he's kind of like opening it up to you in another context, and then bringing himself to you, uh, bringing you to himself. That really is incredible. And I want to sort of wrap up here by asking you about you're searching for community, you're searching for a spiritual home, like we all are. You know, you've got. I think it was Kelvin who talked about our hearts are like idol factories, and Kelvin, for those of you who don't know, was like a Reformation era theologian. And what he means by that is we are created to worship. Like we will search for things that are supernatural. And I think that we are designed to want that. We want that to exist. And its true fulfillment is found in Christ. But I wanted to ask you about, in your search for a spiritual home now and in community, why didn't you settle back in a Russian Orthodox church, at least for now? And what are your opinions on Russian Orthodoxy? You and I were speaking before we started recording, actually, about how we've seen certain people actually leaving non-denominational churches, Baptists, Presbyterians, whatever the churches we're more familiar with in America and Australia, for Orthodoxy. And growing up in that kind of cultural context, I just wanted to sort of pick your brain on that a little bit.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like the deeper I go into my faith, the more I would maybe consider going back to Orthodoxy. Certainly at the time that, and by the way, for context, everyone, it's been just over a year now that I've even been going to church. And it's been maybe 4 months since I've left the New Age behind for good. So it's been a very short time that I've really called myself a believer. I don't even know where to mark that distinction, because it was a gradual process, and then a stark conviction of leaving behind the New Age. So I'm still a baby Christian for sure. And at the time that I first started attending churches, we actually went to an Orthodox church. I forgot to mention this. We went to an Orthodox church once as part of our church search, and we went to a Catholic church because that's what my husband grew up in. And the Orthodox church, just, I think for me at least, I don't know if every Orthodox church is like this in the West, in America or Australia, but growing up, there was, like I said, that lack of education, that lack of Bible teaching, which I sorely need as a baby Christian. And that's really the primary thing that drew me into kind of more Western churches, is this education around who God is, and even how to get into his word, and how to like the historical context of the biblical stories and that sort of thing that really isn't present in my experience in Orthodox churches. I also went to an Orthodox church after I came to Christ with my parents once. And at least that for me was kind of the same as my other experiences, where I honestly don't understand what's going on. That's really the primary reason I wouldn't go there as a new believer. I wasn't understanding what was going on. Now, I think the more that I get into the word, where I get into it every day now, and I'm really hungry for understanding and really like education in Christ, I feel like if I build upon that foundation, maybe I will go back and see something totally different in the church that I couldn't then, when no one had educated to me on why we do certain things, why certain like ceremonies are done. I couldn't even understand in Russian the service at all, because it's this old Russian. It's like a version of Russian. It's really hard to understand. It's like kind of like reading Shakespeare now, but I would say even more difficult than that. So it's like an old Russian dialect, basically, that the church service is performed in. And actually the Bibles are in Russian Orthodox, at least I think Russian Protestant Bibles are different, but Russian Orthodox Bibles are written in that old Russian, which is another reason why if you open the Bible, you're not going to understand anything. It's going to be really, really hard to read. So that sort of thing just kind of made it really inaccessible. And is probably the primary reason we didn't go back. The more I hear kind of people, like you said, people from the West going over to more traditional churches like Orthodox churches or even Catholic churches, which are also more kind of ceremonial, and have more of those kind of traditions built into the service, I actually hear kind of the opposite almost, where they love the depth, they love the richness, and not just of, for example, my husband loves that in the Catholic Church, there's this old tradition. Like there's a traditional element to it, and he loves the fact that it just has tradition. Even beyond that, I think coming in there with a biblical foundation already, you see why they do certain things. Plus, I've also heard it said that the fact that I think in English it's patriarch, right? Yeah, the Orthodox kind of church leader. So that the fact that the patriarch has really intense, deep training in the faith, and you can really come to him as an authority in biblical matters, versus like a non-denominational pastor might not have as much of like a rich education. Some do, some don't. It really kind of depends on who you get, right? They really vary. So yeah, I guess the short of it is, we'll see. I may or may not go back. My dad would be so happy. The other thing with Orthodox, at least with Russian Orthodox culture, it's, I guess I can only speak for my family. At least with my family, there's a huge mistrust of anything else. So my dad is very unhappy about the fact that I went to and am currently going to a non-Orthodox church. And they don't really consider it proper or legit. So there's also that element that I also honestly partly turned me off from Orthodoxy, but it's mostly, I think, cultural and not like proper Orthodoxy.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. And so, yeah, as we wrap up here, was there anything else you wanted to say to all of our listeners? I want to thank you for your vulnerability and being so open. I just wanted to know, was there anything else you wanted to sort of get across while we're still speaking?
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I would say, if I want to say this right, if you feel like something is tugging on your heart and you're scared, or you don't know what it is, I would have a couple suggestions for you. One, you can reach out to me or anyone like me, like anyone you have on this podcast, Stephen, like anyone you personally relate to. You can reach out to me. You could scroll through my Instagram. You can see my past. I don't delete anything. Luckily, I didn't have any like half naked stuff on there, like a lot of coaches do. So I didn't have to delete anything like that. I really kept everything up. So you'll see the stark and sudden transformation. You'll see everything I used to teach. You want to see more about what I used to teach on shadow work, you can see that. Like, you'll see my full past on there. And I was always, it's something that I guess God has gifted me with. I was always very, very vulnerable. I would like cry on Instagram, and very like easily happy to do so. So you'll see everything on there. You'll see like my full story. And whether you want to just like peruse that and see whether you're essentially understood, whether you can relate to me, whatever it is, or you just want to talk to me, or you want to reach out to Stephen. Or I would even suggest, the one thing that I wish I did earlier was I opened the Bible and just read it, or even read like the Message, which I didn't know what it was until I was in the Christian world, but it's basically a paraphrase of the Bible, right? It's the easiest thing to read. I wish I opened the Bible sooner, because not only I feel like supernaturally, right, his word works in us and it sows seeds and it grows and all this stuff. It changes us from the inside out, but even just purely intellectually, it gave me a different understanding of what Christianity is. It gave me a different understanding of who Jesus is, there's a whole different idea of who Jesus is in the new community, a hippie Jesus. So it gave me a whole different understanding of God and Jesus and the Christian faith. And even just purely intellectually, like, that's interesting. It's not necessarily a sign that you're like going to convert or anything. I'm not trying to convert you through the Bible. I want you to have all the information. And I wish I didn't push away Christianity because of what I saw about it in the media or in movies or in TV. Yeah. And if you ever want to talk to me about anything regarding Christianity or otherwise, I just want to see my doors open.
That's beautiful. And yeah, I can't think of a better place to finish there. So yeah, thank you, Anastasia. Thanks for coming on, guys. Please check out all of Anastasia's links. Go check out her Instagram, her YouTube channel. I know you said you're going to be doing more podcasts on there, so people can find that in the description box below for their convenience. Hey, if you want to help us out, it helps us out a lot if you like or share this video. If you subscribe here and over on Anastasia's channel, YouTube pushes the video out to far more people, helps us get her story out there. So thank you guys for watching. Thanks for your time, and God bless.